for all, and so we ask that you'd help us this night as we seek to know you better by examining your word. Would you give us discerning hearts and a willingness to put into action what we learn, that we may glorify you, our Heavenly Father, and bring praise to the name of your beloved Son. Would you give wisdom to Tom tonight as he seeks to bring forth your word to our children downstairs, and would you show mercy to those little ones as you have to us? Would you continue growing us in love and unity as we press on together to eternal life in the new heavens and the new earth with you. Amen. Please stand.
Come thou fount of every blessing, to my heart to sing thy praise. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of thy Would you please be seated?
Just getting linked up here on the AirPlay. Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us again as we continue our Old Testament survey. By way of reminder, last week, Pastor Matt went through 1 Samuel, so tonight we're picking that up again right away with 2 Samuel. Now, before we do that, by way of a small aside, we didn't get 1st and 2nd Samuel until the Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate, so it's actually a somewhat recent advent. My point is, it was just the book of Samuel in the Hebrew Old Testament. My point with that is, in our minds, we kind of separate them, and it's helpful to be able to easily go and find different chapters and verses. But just, I'm saying it now because just try not to separate 1 Samuel, what Pastor Matt did last week, from what we're doing tonight in your heads. It's one book, but it's just split up for the sake of organization. So with that being said, let's go ahead and do our quick review. What is the theme of 1 Samuel, for those of you who memorized it? Yeah, Judges to Kings. Okay, excellent. And the outline, how many chapters and what's the split? Anybody remember? Okay, good. Yeah, so 31 chapters. And so you have a preparation for the monarchy and an implementation of the monarchy. And so let me throw that up on the screen here. Now, we don't normally cover the key chapters from the previous week, but I'm going to just very quickly hit some of them. Again, because technically it's one book, and so I just want to make sure that we have it fresh in our mind because we're moving directly from that into what we're covering tonight. So we have Eli to Samuel. Now, if you recall, we're coming out of the time of the judges, and so everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So not only are they the people doing what's right in their own eyes, but most of the judges themselves are not holy and godly people. Most of them are ungodly. But on top of that, once you start 1 Samuel, you come to find out that even the priesthood is compromised. You have Hophni and Phinehas committing all sorts of evil, and ultimately God chooses to judge them for it. Now, he raises up Samuel to replace Eli and Eli's corrupted family. And Samuel's faithful, but he gets to the end of his life, and his sons are found to be unfaithful, right? And so the nation says, we need a king. We need a king. Now, they do this poorly. They don't go to God and say, if it would be your will, would you give us a king? They demand it. Give us a king. And God says, fine, you can have a king. So he gives them Saul. Saul does well for about a chapter, and he begins to fall apart. You remember Pastor Matt going into the obedience is better than sacrifice, right? What's this bleating that I hear in my ears, Samuel says to him. And at that point, the kingdom is ripped away from Saul, and it is given to David. Now, I believe last week you guys ended with the anointing of David and Goliath. So the rest of 1 Samuel from that point on is essentially a cat and mouse game between Saul and David. Saul becomes increasingly paranoid and pursues David high and low throughout the nation, seeking to destroy him. And the book ends with the death of Saul. So the reason I started with it's technically one book is because now we're in 2 Samuel, and he died in the end of 1 Samuel, and so where do we pick up? With the death of Saul, okay? So that's where we are with 2 Samuel. So let me now throw up our slide for 2 Samuel. So our theme here, as you can see, is David's reign as king. So we've shifted from Saul in 1 Samuel now to David in 2 Samuel. And our outline here, we have 24 chapters, and it's divided into 3 parts, and it's actually pretty helpful. They came up with the good, the bad, and the ugly. So that should be pretty easy to memorize. At least keep that in your head. So basically how it goes is David rises to power. Things are looking very good. That's the good part. The bad starts in chapter 11 with adultery and murder. And the ugly is essentially the entire rest of the book is everything that comes as a consequence to chapter 11. So just by way of heads up, most of what we're going to be talking about tonight is going to take place in the first two sections, the good and the bad. And the reason for that is you can essentially fast forward then from the bad through to the rest because everything just starts to fall apart at that point, okay? Now, in terms of key chapters, we have chapter 5, David king over all Israel. Now, the key thing to note there is all Israel. He doesn't start that way, and we'll get into that in just a minute. In chapter 6, we have the ark being returned to Jerusalem. If you remember last week, the ark was lost through a very foolish act by Hophni and Phinehas and treating it like it was some sort of magic token, right? They brought it into battle and they lost it. It was returned, but then not to Jerusalem. In 7, we have the Davidic covenant. This is really important, and so we're going to spend some time on this tonight. In 11, we have David and Bathsheba, I already mentioned that. 12, we have Nathan's rebuke. Well worth reading, both for what you learn, obviously, of God and of David, but you learn some things about Uriah as well. In chapter 20, you have Absalom's exile and his revolt. And then in 24, David numbers the people. All right. So in chapters 21 through 24, just as one last aside before we dive into some key events through this book, you have a section that doesn't fit chronologically with the rest of the book. So it starts with the death of Saul. It flows all the way through, and you're like, yeah, I follow. And then it's like, what happened? What are these events? Well, these are actually asides and a postscript, to the book. So don't look to these chapters as being chronological. What they do instead is they focus on David's relationship with the Lord and the various roles that David then plays within the nation. So he acts as a judge, as a priest, and then as a leader of God's people on earth. So you get to the end of the book, and that's what you're going to see in those chapters where you're just like, this doesn't seem to fit. It shifted from storyline to relationship and some of the roles that David plays, okay? So let's move to our first event. Our first event is David is anointed king over Judah. So this is chapter 2, if you want to flip there in your Bibles. Samuel's chapter 2. We're skipping over the death of Jonathan and Saul, the news that's brought to David that they have died, and we're jumping right to him being anointed king over Judah. Now, I have up here on the screen Judah. You can see it's actually quite a sizable area, and you can actually probably also see that we have this strange chunk missing right in the middle. It's kind of like the firstborn, or I don't know if you have someone in your family who just cuts the middle out of the dessert. But that's kind of what you have. It's interesting. You have the tribe of Simeon just smack dab right in the middle of Judah. The interesting thing about this is Simeon is not allied with Judah. They're actually allied with the rest of the tribes. And so what you have there is, that would be somewhat difficult if you think about that. How do you do trade as you're sort of surrounded? But it goes to show the complicated nature of a divided nation. So let me, hold on. I'm still learning how to do some of this. Now, I want to highlight a couple things here. So this is just a closer view, and I want to point out a couple of cities. So the first is going to be Hebron. Does anybody know the significance of Hebron? Yeah, good, excellent. So it's the capital. So this is where David essentially sets up shop while he's king over just Judah. Okay, so you can see he's not all that far from Bethlehem up here. And then what we have up here is Kiriath Jearim. Does anybody remember what this is? What's the significance of this town? So this is where the ark ended up in 1 Samuel. So they lost it in battle. The Philistines are like, get this thing out of here, right? They give it back to Israel, and Israel, they're scared of it too, and so they kind of just park it over here. So this is where the ark is, up here. Hebron, as you can see, is the capital, and so that's sort of the lay of the land. right now. I think I have one more slide here. No, I don't. All right, so that's just the lay of the land. Now, again, the thing to note here is that he's not king over the entire nation. You would think that maybe the death of Saul and Jonathan, it's like, okay, all my troubles are over for David. I've been running for all these years. It's time to rest. Come to find out, that's not the case at all. It's moving from one thing to the next, much like our life, right? You think, if I can just get to this point, things will be better. David probably thinking, if Saul can just die, things will get better. Well, you come to find out, it's pretty painful still, and it takes essentially 7 years before David is made king over the entirety of the nation. So look with me, though, chapter 2, verses 8 through 10, and we're going to see what happened with Israel in comparison to Judah. So verse 8, now Abner, the son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and he made him king over Gilead. I'm just going to skip over the tribes, even over all Israel. And then at verse 10, it says, Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he became king. He was king for 2 years. The house of Judah, however, followed David. Now, you would think maybe perhaps it's just separate. We kind of keep our peace, right? You being the son of Saul, you kind of keep your area, and I keep mine. Well, it turns out that's not the case. It's immediately war and conflict between the two tribes, or the two nations, essentially, is what they are. And so if you look down to verse 12, you see immediately a conflict. And so it's talking about Abner, right? And so he takes the servants of Saul out, and then Joab in verse 13 and the servants of David go out. And this is tragic, right? Verse 14, Abner says to Joab being the leader of David's men, says, now let the young men arise and hold a contest before us. And Joab said, let them arise. So they arose and went over by count, 12 for Benjamin and 12 for the servants of David. Each of them seized his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side. So they fell down together. Now, the battle doesn't stop there. It proceeds. But this is just an utterly tragic state of affairs, if you really consider it. You have God's people, Israel, whom he redeemed out of Egypt. He gave them the land. He gave them peace on every side. They squandered it. And now you have young men in the prime of life slaughtering each other, right? So it's actually, it captures very well this contest between these 12, the sad state of affairs. Now the battle goes on, and we're introduced, though, to some important people in verse 18. So verse 18 of chapter 2, it says, now the 3 sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now, these are important men. They play significant roles to some extent, one extent or another. And so let's take a look real quick at where they come from. Before I do, anybody know who they are in terms of relation to David? Yeah, nephews. Good. Excellent. So I always think, like son of Zeruiah, I always assume Zeruiah is the dad, right? You see David, son of Jesse. Well, we're going to find out that's not the case. So in 1 Chronicles 2, it's giving a genealogy. And right now it's recounting the sons of Jesse. And so it says Ozem being the 6th, David the 7th, and then here we find out, and their sisters were Zeruiah and Abigail. And the 3 sons of Zeruiah were Abishai, Joab, and Asahel. Now, Asahel is killed shortly after verse 18. He's chasing down Abner, and he takes a spear through the stomach. It's unfortunate, obviously. Asahel, you find out later at the end of the book in the recounting of David's mighty men that he was one of David's mighty men. They were, I guess, to use a secular reference, they were like a SEAL Team 6. They were a Delta Force. They were the best of the best of the best who had proved themselves over and over and over again in battle. So these were not young and inexperienced warriors, but they were very experienced men. And these sons of, Zeruiah, especially Joab, play a significant role as we go through the book. Now, Joab in particular, keep your eye on him because we're going to see him shortly after this. So our second main event in the book is that Abner switches sides. So turn to chapter 3. If you look at verse 1, you see that war continues. It's not just this one battle. It says, now the war between the house of Saul and the house of David was long. And David grew steadily stronger, but the house of Saul grew continually weaker. So this is just this long, slow decline, just like with David and Saul, as you saw David in 1 Samuel slowly rise to prominence, and you saw Saul slowly descend. So it's continuing in the same way here. Now, if you turn over to verse 6 of chapter 3, we're going to see what happens here. Why does Abner, who, by the way, remember, he's the one who set up Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth is just a puppet. Abner is the one with the control, with the power. And so what we see here in chapter 6 is that Abner is, not only was he strong enough to put him there in the first place, but he's becoming stronger. So now it happened that there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, that Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. Now, Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah. And Ishbosheth said to Abner, why have you gone into my father's concubine? So there's an accusation here. There's no assumption. It's not, I heard this. He simply lays it out as an accusation. Why have you gone into my father's concubine? Now, what that would be if it was true is technically a play on the throne. To essentially pursue one of the king's wives or his concubines would essentially be to try and take the place of the king himself. So if it's true, it is obviously a move by Abner to assert dominance. But Abner's response is interesting. He gets very angry, and he gives this somewhat long response where he says, am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah? Today I show loving kindness to the house of Saul, your father, to his brothers, to his friends, and not delivered you into the hands of David, and yet you charge me with guilt concerning the woman. May God do so to Abner and more also, if, as Yahweh has sworn to David, I do not do this for him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and to establish the throne of David over Israel and over Judah from Dan even to Beersheba. Now, the interesting thing here is it's actually somewhat entertaining. Abner never actually addresses the accusation that was brought to him. I don't know if you ever get this with your kids, right? It's like, son, did you do X? It's like, Dad, was I not faithful? Have I not this? Have I not that? You get to the end, right? And you're like, okay, but did you throw your clothes down the laundry chute, right? He never actually, if you read this, he never addresses it. So that can be taken a couple of ways. Some say, basically, I'm not going to waste my time with responding to such silly accusations. The other way you could take it is it's totally true, and he's just sick of dealing with Saul's son here. But either way, the ultimate point of this is that it's moving, God's using this to move the kingdom back to a unified state under David. So give me 1 second here while I find my place. All right, so Abner, at this point, we already read, he essentially says to Ishbosheth, I'm giving the kingdom to David. So what he does is he then travels back. It's quite a long road, actually. He travels down, and he meets David in Hebron, and he proposes a unification of the kingdom, to which David agrees. Now, I mentioned earlier that Joab is essentially he's a mighty thorn in the side of David throughout his reign, and he's going to pop up soon. Well, here he pops up again. So essentially in verse 22, Joab comes in from a raid, and he hears that David has made an agreement with Abner, and he's upset. He's upset because, if you remember, his brother was killed by Abner in the battle, and he wants his revenge. So he essentially circumvents the will of David in verse 26, and he sends messengers after Abner and essentially lies to him and says, hey, please come back. And so, let's see. So verse 27, when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into the middle of the gate to speak with him privately, and there he struck him in his belly so that he died on account of the blood of Asahel, his brother. Now, if you go down to verse 30, you see that it wasn't just Joab, but you find out that his brother Abishai was guilty as well. It says, so Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner because he had put their brother Asahel to death in the battle at Gibeon. Now, ultimately, this is murder. This is revenge, personally taken. But if you recall the battle in which Asahel died, that was a lawful killing, right? It's tragic that the sons of Israel are killing each other, but his death was lawful in the sense that they were at war. This was in no way lawful. And the unfortunate thing here is David has an opportunity to essentially get rid of Joab and Abishai. He could do that, right? He's the king at this point. He has God's law. He knows the requirements for murder, but he doesn't. So let's look at verse 39 of chapter 3. This is David speaking. He says, "Thus I am weak today, though anointed king, and these men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too difficult for me. May Yahweh repay the evildoer according to his evil." So the second half, you're like, okay, may Yahweh repay the evildoer according to his evil. That's great. The problem is David's king. So you have the authority to get rid of him, so maybe you should do that. He doesn't, and so what ends up happening is Joab becomes this perpetual thorn in his side. He commits murder several more times throughout the course of his time as a military commander, and you find out that in the end, ultimately David's son Solomon is the one who has to put Joab to death because he remains a thorn even in Solomon's side. Now, ultimately, like I said, this series of events leads to the downfall of Ishbosheth, and it unifies all of Israel under David. And so what happens is David takes Jerusalem and makes it the capital. So I'm just showing you here on the map the distance. It's not too far. If you recall, Hebron here was the capital while he was king over just Judah. Bethlehem, if you remember with Ruth, is not all that far from Jerusalem. But I have here another zoomed in slide, and what I want to show you is the location of Jerusalem. Now, this little line here, as you can see this dotted one, this little line here is the separation between the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. Now, he chooses ultimately a capital in Benjamin for the unified nation. Now, some of that has to do with the fact that he's essentially taking over the kingdom that was loyal to Saul, right? And so David's from the tribe of Judah, and so essentially in an effort to extend an olive branch, so to speak, to the rest of the nation and show not only am I from Judah and my capital isn't just there, no, I'm going to move my capital. And so he moves it right across the border. If you recall, David's from Bethlehem, so it's not too far from home. But essentially, here's the capital, and that's where he sets up his kingdom. Now, our next main event, let me close this, is that the ark returns to Jerusalem. So this is in chapter 6. Now, recall that the ark has been sort of sidelined since it was lost in battle. If you recall with the slide, let me see if I can pull it up again. There we go. Kiriath Jearim, right up there to the north. That's essentially where it was parked. Now, it was parked there for some time, actually. In 1 Samuel chapter 7, Matt went over this last week, but I'm just highlighting the length of time. Now, it says in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 7 of 1 Samuel, "Now it happened from the day when the ark remained at Kiriath Jearim that the time was long. It was 20 years." All right? So it's 20 years. It's a long time that it's been essentially sidelined. Now that the kingdom has been unified, it's all under David's throne, it's time to bring it back. It's time to bring it back. Well, we come to find out that even this can't go without incident. It doesn't go all that smoothly. They're essentially bringing it on a cart, and you recall the cattle almost upset it, and a guy named Uzzah essentially reaches out his hand and touches the ark in an effort to stabilize it, and he is killed. Now, the point here is you would think that the people of Israel learned their lesson. If you recall last week with Pastor Matt's discussion of 1 Samuel, 50,000 of the people of Israel died because they would not follow the law that they were given in the treatment of the ark. In fact, it says explicitly that they looked inside the ark, which they were not permitted to do. And so God wiped out 50,000 of them because God is holy. You're my people, I'm holy, so you will do as I say. Well, essentially what you have here is the same sin. Normal people are not supposed to be reaching out and touching the ark. And so, again, it's reiterated that God is holy. Well, David's reaction is that he's very angry. He's very angry with God, but he's also very fearful. It says here in chapter 6 that he leaves the ark with a man named Obed-Edom. But he does that only until he hears that God has blessed Obed-Edom. Comes to find out that this guy's actually doing quite well. For whatever reason, as long as the ark has been with him, God continues to bless him. And so David takes that essentially as a sign of God's favor and says, let's continue on, and he returns it to Jerusalem. It's at that point you have the incident with David's wife, Michal, where he's dancing before the Lord with joy, and she resents him for it. But we come now to the Davidic covenant. Now, Matt said last week that the giving of the Davidic covenant is one of the most important events of the Old Testament, but its reach doesn't stop there. Through the rest of the Old Testament, you'll see continued references to David's throne, and this carries on into the New Testament as well. Now, I do have some quotes from just a couple authors on what they're saying about the covenant as a whole, just to help drive home the point of its importance. And then we're going to actually read it together, and we'll talk about it, all right? So the events, this is one author, the events portrayed in this section may rightly be understood as the flowering of a Torah prophecy, the climax of David's life, and the foundation for a major theme in the writings of the latter prophets. Another author says that this section is the center and focus of Deuteronomic history itself. Another describes it as the dramatic and theological center of the entire Samuel corpus and the most crucial theological statement in the Old Testament. The other thing worth noting, it's actually somewhat interesting about this, is the covenant that's given, God's words to Nathan, which are then conveyed to David, it's actually the longest monologue from God to man since Moses. It's 197 words, and the point, though, of it being so large, it suggests that it's meant to be interpreted as centrally important. It's very important, all right? So let's actually read it together. So it's chapter 7, verses 8 through 17. Now recall at this point that David has brought the ark back. He's proposed the building of a house for God, but God responds instead to David via Nathan. So he says, "So now thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says Yahweh of hosts, I myself took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be ruler over my people Israel. And I've been with you wherever you've gone, and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and I will make you a great name, like the name of the great men who are on the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in their own place and not be disturbed again. And the unrighteous will not afflict them any more as formerly, even from the day that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. Yahweh also declares to you that Yahweh will make a house for you. When your days are fulfilled, and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up one of your seed after you who will come forth from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will reprove him with the rod of men and the strikes of the sons of men. But my loving kindness shall not be removed from him, as I removed it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever." According to all these words, and according to all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. Well, this covenant, we've already seen, is centrally important, but it is messianic in nature. It guarantees a physical line of David that finds its endpoint in Christ himself. If you recall in the Abrahamic covenant, God promised that in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. But through whom? We know from Abraham, but then through whom? Well, he made that covenant to Abraham. And if you recall, Abraham had Isaac and Ishmael, and God chose Isaac. Isaac had Jacob and Esau, and God chose Jacob. Jacob had his sons, and God chose the tribe of Judah. And here we see a final choice, so to speak, in that God now chooses David. From you will come this king. Now, this covenant, like we said, is referenced throughout the rest of the Old Testament in the prophetic writings. It's a message of hope that's continually returned to during the years of exile. The prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Hosea and Amos and Zechariah continually reference this covenant, and they come back to the words that God has said. From you, right? This eternal throne that will be established, right? And so it's a message of hope during the years when everything looks like it's going to be, like it will all fall apart. So let's look a little bit more at this message of hope in Psalm chapter 89, or Psalm 89. There's three, if you didn't know, there's three main passages where the Davidic covenant is highlighted in the scriptures. So it's 2 Samuel 7, it is Psalm 89, and then we have 1 Chronicles 17. But let's go to Psalm 89, and I want to highlight just a couple things out of this. Now, this psalm is believed to be an exilic psalm. If you look towards the back of it, in verse 49 first, let's go there. The psalmist says, "Where are your former loving kindnesses, O Lord, which you swore to David in your faithfulness? Remember, O Lord, the reproach of your slaves." This is one of those times, yet again, where the nation is in significant pain. And so what do? They return to the covenant, and they do what so many before them did, which is they call out before the Lord and say, "Do you not remember? Remember us. Remember your covenant." And so this is highlighted in verse 19 through 37. We see a more detailed, there's more information given here than in the 2 Samuel passage. It says, "Formerly you spoke in vision to your holy ones and said, I have bestowed help to a mighty one. I have exalted one chosen from the people. I have found David my servant. With my holy oil I have anointed him, with whom my hand will be established. My arm also will strengthen him. The enemy will not deceive him, nor the son of unrighteousness afflict him. But I shall crush his adversaries before him and strike those who hate him. My faithfulness and my loving kindness will be with him, and in my name his horn will be exalted. I shall also set his hand on the sea and his right hand on the rivers. He will call to me, 'You are my Father, my God, and the rock of my salvation.' I also shall make him my firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. My loving kindness I will keep for him forever, and my covenant shall be confirmed to him. So I will set up his seed to endure forever, and his throne as the days of heaven. If his sons forsake my law and do not walk in my judgments, if they profane my statutes and do not keep my commandments, then I will punish their transgression with the rod and their iniquity with striking. But I will not break off my loving kindness from him, nor deal falsely in my faithfulness. My covenant I will not profane, nor will I alter what comes forth from my lips. Once I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. His seed shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. It shall be established forever, like the moon and the witness in the sky is faithful." Well, this covenant is unique. Obviously, it's unique in the sense that we now see that the kingly line has been chosen. But if you recall, we so far have seen both conditional and unconditional covenants in the past. The Abrahamic covenant was what? You guys remember? Unconditional. Okay, good. And the Mosaic covenant was conditional. Okay. Well, what's unique here is that there are both unconditional and conditional elements to this covenant. So let's first note the unconditional nature of this covenant. Let's first look to the unconditional. So let's go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7. If you have a pencil, it might be worth underlining these if you'd like, we're going to look at the I wills. And what I'd like you to see is that these are the same I wills. If you would go to Genesis chapter 12, you would see the same thing. But let's just go through and we'll highlight them. So if you want to look at the I's, you could do that as well. That's also an interesting one, is you just see the sovereignty of God, where he says, I took you, I. But let's look just at the I wills. So in verse 9, he says, I will make you a great name. In chapter 10, I will appoint a place for my people. In chapter 11, I will give you rest. In chapter 12, I will raise up one of your seed after you. Chapter 13, I will establish the throne of his kingdom. 14, I will be a father to him. I will reprove him with the rod of men. And let's see, did I miss any? I might have missed one or two. But the point there is to highlight God is saying, I will do these things. At no point is he saying, in regards to those, I will do this if you do this. He simply states, I'm going to do these things. So that's just a quick highlight of that. We'll come back to it. But I said there's a conditional nature to it as well. Well, what is that? So let's look at verse 14. Verse 14. So it says, I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will reprove him with the rod of men and the strikes of the sons of men. Now, I said that this was messianic in nature and that ultimately Christ is found to be the son of David. But what is this when it says, when he commits iniquity, I will reprove him with the rod of men? Is this talking about Christ sinning? No. So in Psalm 89, the reason I went there is it highlighted the sins of the sons of David. And it again reiterated that if they sin, God will punish them. But if they obey, God will bless them. And so we come to find out on the conditional side of this covenant, David doesn't make it past a couple more chapters before he himself comes to experience this after his sin with Bathsheba. But in Kings, as you begin to see the nation begin to fall apart, you will see some godly kings, and you see this fulfilled, right? In the conditional nature of it, where they're godly, they obey, and God blesses the nation in those times. But when they're ungodly and they refuse to obey, God curses them and the nation. But what we see with this combination is that even if they are wicked and God has to drive them away into exile, because of the unconditional elements to this covenant, he will always preserve a seed of David. Does that make sense? So you get to the end of Kings, and Kings is, if you didn't know, Kings is an exilic book. It was written while the nation is grieving. They're gone. They're not even in their homeland. And it's recounting their evil kings. They're evil kings, and it's essentially answering the question, why are we here? Well, this is why you're here. Wicked kings. Wicked kings. But it ends, if you didn't know, Kings ends with talking about positively a seed of David. And what that is at the end of the book is this small glimmer of hope. A small glimmer of hope. And that carries on through all the way until we see the birth of Christ. Now, I said that there's one more passage where the Davidic covenant is highlighted, so I think I have a slide for this one. Give me 1 second. Yeah, all right. So if you stay in 2 Samuel 7, look at 14, verse 14 of 2 Samuel 7. I'll read it, and then I'm going to read this one. So 2 Samuel 7:14, I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will reprove him with the rod of men and the strikes of the sons of men. Now look up on the screen. This is 1 Chronicles. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me, and I will not remove my loving kindness from him, as I removed it from him who was before you. So what's missing in the Chronicles one? Yeah, the sins, okay? The reason that's missing is Chronicles, if you didn't know it, is a post-exilic book. So we have Samuel being pre-exile. We have Kings being exilic. Now we have Chronicles being post-exile. And if you don't remember, in Ezra and Nehemiah, there's a combination of joy and weeping, right? You have the old men who are weeping because they see the temple, and even though it's been rebuilt, it's nothing like it used to be. And it's mixed with the joy of the young men because they've now returned. Well, Chronicles is written during this time of weeping and joy and this weird combination. And what it's doing is Chronicles has a messianic focus. A messianic focus. It's actually, if you didn't know, the last book in the Hebrew Old Testament. And the point of that is you move all the way through from Genesis all the way through the Hebrew Old Testament, and it ends with Chronicles being someone is coming. Someone is coming who is not like the wicked kings that you have had up to this point. And so what we see here in 1 Chronicles 17, the one up on the screen, is there's someone coming who will never sin like these kings have. Isn't that cool? Yeah. So, but ultimately, what we see, like I said, is that Christ is the promised heir. So I have another passage here, so let's see that. There's a lot of passages, I don't have time to get into them, but I just want to read this for you. You can look up on the screen for it to save time. This is Paul. He says, "Then they asked for a king, and God gave them Saul, the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, for 40 years. And after he'd removed him, he raised up David to be their king, about whom he also said, bearing witness, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my heart, who will do all my will. From the seed of this man, according to promise, God has brought to Israel a Savior, Jesus." Well, there's divine declarations all through the New Testament in 7 major ways that show that Jesus, let me rephrase that, I'm sorry. There are 7 ways that the New Testament teaches that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant. I have lots of references. I don't have time, but let me just read them quick. He's the son of David. He's one who would rise from the dead. He's the builder of the house for God. He's the possessor of the throne, the possessor of an eternal kingdom, the Son of God, and the product of an immaculate conception. Now, this covenant was fulfilled in one sense in Christ, in that he is that promised seed of David. But the throne that's promised to David is not a spiritual throne. I just want to point this out. Matt has continued to highlight through that the land doesn't go away. The land promises don't go away. And so what lots of people tend to do is to say that the throne of David is just merely a spiritual thing. But this is essentially an already but not yet sort of situation. So Christ is that seed of David. But it will be ultimately fulfilled when Christ returns to the earth to reign forever. All right? So with that, that's the Davidic covenant. There's a lot more that I probably should have said, but let's move on to our next major section, and this is David and Bathsheba. I mentioned before that essentially 2 Samuel, you get up to chapter 11, and then everything that follows chapter 11 is essentially, it just falls apart for David largely. So this will be our last major section that we focus on. So it's chapter 11, if you want to turn there. This is David and Bathsheba, and we leave the wonderful blessings and the hopes of the covenant in chapter 7, and we barely make it a foot out the door before we fall on our faces here. David sins in an awful way here. Now, there's a couple things worth noting. These are argued over, but they're probably worth noting. Okay, so first of all, you notice David's at home. It says that the nation is gone at war. So David should probably be at war. Now, there's arguments. Technically, he's the king. He doesn't need to be there. But even Saul, when Goliath was confronting the nation, was on the front lines. Now, he didn't ultimately confront Goliath, but even Saul was there with them. You don't have to agree with that, but he should probably be there. The second thing worth noting is Bathsheba probably shouldn't be bathing in the open. Now, it's amazing the things that people argue about, but they say, well, it's that time, they didn't have indoor plumbing, so obviously you would bathe outside. Curtains exist, right? Curtains exist. Basically, though, whatever, if you want to, you can take all that, you can throw it away and say it doesn't matter, but the end result is adultery. The end result is adultery. Now, there's discussion today in light of the Me Too movement on whether David raped Bathsheba, but I would like to note that there's no indication from the text that this actually happened. I won't get technical, but in hermeneutics, particularly regarding historical narrative, what details the author chooses to include and not include is the primary method of determining what the author means to say. Okay, it's the primary means. So what are some of the details not included in this section regarding David and Bathsheba's adultery? Well, if you recall in Deuteronomy chapter 22, there are provisions regarding the guilt of a woman who's raped. Okay? If she cries out, there's no guilt. None. She has committed no wrong. And at that point, though, it still goes on to say that the rapist must die. Okay? So keep this in mind. Now, I'm going to put a passage on the screen. It's big, so if you can't read this, just turn to 2 Samuel 13, verses 11 through 14. So this is the story of Amnon and Tamar. So this is the same book, same author, okay? My point is, you can't say she was raped here when there's no details of it, but now we have details that clearly show rape is happening, okay? So we have here in 2 Samuel chapter 13, we have Amnon saying to Tamar, he takes hold of her and says, "Come, lie with me, my sister." But she said to him, "No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. As for me, where could I get rid of my reproach? And as for you, you will be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. So now please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you." But he was not willing to listen to her voice. He was stronger than she, so he violated her and lay with her. Well, so we see here that Tamar resists in every possible way, and yet she is still raped. And like I said, the author includes these details here, but none of these details are present in reference to Bathsheba. And so the conclusion that can be drawn here is that while David did initiate by sending for her, that Bathsheba appears to be a willing participant. Now, Bathsheba is actually a well-connected woman. Most of you simply know her as the wife of Uriah, and if you read towards the end of the book, David's Mighty Men, you see Uriah's name there, and so you think, okay, he was a man of prominence, but she was actually more connected than that. She was the daughter of another one of David's mighty men by the name of Eliam or Eliam. He's also listed in chapter 23. So you have two of David's mighty men who are wronged in this instance. But in addition to that, she's the granddaughter of Ahithophel. Does anybody remember who Ahithophel is? Okay, so he's David's most trusted advisor who plays a prominent role in Absalom's coup later on. And so this was, the point here is this was not smart in every possible way. Obviously, it was sin against God. It was sin against Uriah. It was sin against Eliam. In every possible way, from top to bottom, this was a very stupid thing to do. And ultimately, as we saw with the Davidic covenant, there would be consequences for that. Now, the character of Uriah is actually quite astounding. We don't have time to dig into it. I see I'm already running out of time. It's quite astounding, though. David, after finding out that he's impregnated Uriah's wife, calls Uriah back from the battlefield, and he's given a reprieve. Now, Uriah, as a mighty man, would not have been somewhere near the back of the lines. He would have been on the front lines, involved in the most dangerous of the missions, and so he's likely tired from battle, and so this reprieve would be great, right? It would be great. I get to go home. I get to see my beautiful wife. How wonderful. But you find out that even while drunk, he refuses to go home. He refuses to participate or to partake, of any of the comforts of peace while his brothers are at war. And so ultimately, David sends him with a message to Joab. And here we once again see Joab involved. And we end up with Uriah being murdered. Now, that sets into motion everything else in the rest of the book. Absalom ultimately attempts a coup, but Absalom is angry because of the rape of his sister Tamar, And that happened, if you recall, as God judges David for his adultery. David does nothing to the rapist. Absalom murders the rapist. Absalom gets exiled. David brings Absalom back, but won't see Absalom, so Absalom just is churning, right? He's churning at this point. And you come to find out later on that Ahithophel, Bathsheba's grandpa, is in league with Absalom, and they together attempt a coup over the throne. Well, the rest of the book ultimately, like I said, flows out of that, and you see the slow decline of David, though you never see the loss of his line because of that Davidic covenant. So in conclusion, God took David from the field. He made him a great king. The covenant that he made with him, though, had both unconditional and conditional elements. In the unconditional, God promises that David's heir will reign forever, and we saw in Acts 13 that Jesus is this heir. On the conditional side of the covenant, God promised that David's sons who obey will be blessed, but those who disobey will be cursed. And when later we see the nation exiled and in a state of near complete destruction, the Davidic covenant is the hope that the prophets and the nation lean on in their time of need. So with that, let's close in prayer. Well, Father, thank you for this time in your word. Thank you for the opportunity to again and again see that you are faithful to us and faithful to your promises. We thank you that you preserve us to the end, for without you preserving us, we would never stand in the judgment. Guard us now as we go, and would you strengthen us in our work ahead this week. Amen. And you are dismissed.